In my previous video, we witnessed one of the greatest ambushes in military history. At the shores of the Lake Trasimene, a Roman army marched into silent fog and walked straight into destruction. But that disaster did not appear out of nowhere. Months earlier, another Roman army had already fallen into Hannibal's trap. Not beside a lake, but beside a freezing river in northern Italy, at the Battle of the Trebia. It was here that Hannibal Barca first demonstrated something terrifying. Roman commanders could be manipulated, Roman pride could be weaponized, and Roman armies could be destroyed. To understand how Rome blindly marched into the catastrophe at Trasimene, we must go back to the winter morning when the trap at Trebia was set. The war between Rome and Carthage had already reshaped the Mediterranean once before. Rome had defeated Carthage in the First Punic War. The result was humiliating. Carthage lost territories, lost fleets, lost prestige. But one Carthaginian family refused to accept that defeat. The Barcid family, led by the legendary general Hamilcar Barca. His son, Hannibal, grew up surrounded by stories of Rome. Stories of humiliation. Stories of revenge. According to ancient writers, when Hannibal was still a boy, his father brought him to an altar. There, Hannibal swore an oath of eternal hostility against Rome. Years later, that oath would begin to unfold. In Spain, Hannibal built an army. African infantry, Spanish swordsmen, cavalry from Numidia, fierce Gallic warriors. But instead of waiting for Rome to invade Spain, Hannibal made a decision that stunned the ancient world. He would invade Italy itself, not by sea, but by land. And the road to Italy led through the Alps, mountains so dangerous that even Roman generals avoided them. Hannibal crossed them anyway. Thousands died in snowstorms and rock slides. But when his army finally descended into Italy, he had achieved something Rome never expected. He had brought the war home. Rome responded quickly. One of the consuls of the Republic that year was Publius Cornelius Scipio. Scipio moved north to intercept Hannibal. The two forces met near the Battle of Ticinus. It was not a large battle, mostly cavalry, but the outcome was alarming. Carthaginian horsemen dominated the field. Roman cavalry broke under pressure. Scipio himself was wounded. He survived only because his young son helped rescue him from the battlefield. The message was clear. Hannibal's cavalry was superior, but Rome still believed its legions would win in a full battle. Soon, another Roman army arrived, led by the second consul, Tiberius Sempronius Longus. Sempronius was ambitious. His political career depended on victory, and Hannibal knew exactly how to use that ambition. The armies gathered in northern Italy. Near the Trebia River, winter had already tightened its grip on the land. The plains were cold and open. The Trebia itself flowed fast and icy. To cross it meant soaking armor and clothing in freezing water. A soldier who fought immediately afterward would already be exhausted. Hannibal saw the opportunity. But first, the armies must be understood, because the balance of power here was not obvious. On one side stood Rome. On the other stood a multinational army held together by Hannibal's leadership. Together, they brought nearly 80,000 men into the region. The Roman army, under Sempronius, numbered about 40,000 soldiers. Its core consisted of Roman citizen legionaries, approximately 16,000 heavy infantry. These were disciplined soldiers trained to fight in tight formations. They carried large shields, 2 heavy throwing spears, and the short stabbing sword known as the gladius. Supporting them were roughly 20,000 allied Italian infantry. These troops fought alongside Rome as part of its alliance system. They were experienced, but not as heavily equipped as Roman legionaries. In front of the army moved the velites, light infantry skirmishers armed with javelins. Their job was to harass the enemy before the main battle. Finally, there were the cavalry, only about 4,000 horsemen, positioned on both wings. This was Rome's weakness. Roman warfare emphasized infantry. Their cavalry rarely matched that of their enemies. But in a straightforward battle, the Romans still believed their infantry would prevail. Hannibal commanded roughly 38,000 troops. But unlike the Roman army, his forces came from many cultures. In the center were Iberian and Gallic infantry, fierce fighters who preferred aggressive combat. Behind them stood the most disciplined troops Hannibal possessed, African heavy infantry, veterans trained to fight in close formation. They were equipped with captured Roman weapons from earlier battles. But the real power of Hannibal's army lay on the wings. Cavalry. Between 8,000 and 10,000 mounted warriors. Numidian light cavalry. Spanish heavy cavalry. Gallic riders. Fast, flexible, deadly. This cavalry advantage would soon become decisive. Hannibal also placed several surviving war elephants near the flanks. Their role was psychological. Roman horses had never faced such animals. But even this was not Hannibal's real plan. His real plan was hidden in the landscape itself. The night before the battle, Hannibal selected 2,000 elite soldiers. Their commander was his younger brother, Mago. Under cover of darkness, these men moved silently toward the battlefield. They crawled into marshland and tall grass near the Roman approach. There they waited. No fires, no noise, just cold silence. They would remain invisible until the exact moment Hannibal needed them. But the Roman army still had to be lured into position. For that, Hannibal turned to his Numidian cavalry, masters of harassment warfare, fast enough to provoke, fast enough to escape, perfect for bait. At dawn, Numidian riders approached the Roman camp. They attacked the outposts. They threw javelins. They taunted the guards. Then they retreated. It looked like panic, but it was not.
Good. They take the bait.
Inside the Roman camp, Sempronius saw an opportunity. The enemy appeared weak. Perhaps Hannibal feared battle. Perhaps victory was within reach. Scipio advised caution. The army should wait. But Sempronius had already made his decision. He ordered the entire army forward, immediately. Roman soldiers marched out of camp without breakfast, without preparation. They marched toward the Trebia River and straight into Hannibal's trap. The Roman army reached the river. The water was icy, but Sempronius ordered the crossing anyway. Thousands of soldiers stepped into the current. Cold water surged around their legs. Armor became heavy. Clothes soaked through. Some men slipped on the rocks beneath the surface. Others struggled to keep their footing. But the army pushed forward. When they finally reached the opposite bank, they were drenched. Their bodies numb, their energy fading. Meanwhile, Hannibal's soldiers had eaten. They had rested. They had warmed themselves with oil against the cold. They were waiting on dry ground, fresh, prepared, and watching the Romans struggle. The trap was almost ready. The Romans formed their traditional battle line. Velita's skirmishers moved ahead. Behind them stretched the massive Roman infantry center. Legionaries formed dense ranks. Allied infantry extended the line outward. Cavalry guarded both wings. Across the plain, Hannibal deployed his army. Iberian and Gallic infantry formed the center. African veterans waited slightly behind them. Cavalry dominated both flanks. The elephants stood near the wings. Hidden nearby, Mago's soldiers remained silent in the marsh. The battlefield fell quiet. Then the fighting began. Skirmishers clashed first. Javelins flew across the field. Then cavalry charged. Almost immediately, the Roman wings began to struggle. Numidian riders harassed them relentlessly. Spanish cavalry struck with force. Roman cavalry began to retreat. Now the Roman infantry stood exposed. But the Roman center pushed forward. Legionaries advanced with discipline. They slammed into Hannibal's infantry line. For a moment, it looked like the Romans might break through. But Hannibal was waiting, because the final part of his trap had not yet appeared. Suddenly, the marsh behind the Roman army erupted. Mago's hidden troops charged from concealment. 2,000 soldiers slammed into the Roman rear. At the same moment, Carthaginian cavalry returned to strike the flanks. The Roman army was trapped. Front, flanks, rear. Confusion spread instantly. Commands disappeared. Units broke apart. Panic followed. Thousands of Roman soldiers ran toward the river. Many drowned in the freezing water. Others fell beneath cavalry blades. The battlefield turned into slaughter. When the battle ended, between 15,000 and 20,000 Roman soldiers were dead. But Hannibal had learned something far more valuable than victory. Roman commanders could be manipulated. Their pride could lure them into traps. And months later, beside a silent lake covered in fog, Hannibal would use the same strategy again. Only this time, the trap would be larger, the destruction greater. The disaster you saw at the Battle of Lake Trasimene, because Trebia was only the beginning. The Battle of the Trebia was more than a victory. It was a lesson. A lesson Hannibal Barca would use again. Months later, beside a silent lake covered in fog, the disaster you saw at the Battle of Lake Trasimene, because Trebia was not the end. It was the beginning. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most brutal battles, thank you for watching. And if you want to explore more stories from ancient warfare, consider subscribing to the Whispered Verdicts. Your support helps keep these stories alive. And there are many more battles waiting to be told.